What happens when Hollywood royalty meets a television host who thinks he can say whatever he wants? It only took 31 seconds of pure disrespect for one of the most respected actors in the business to reach his breaking point and deliver the kind of verbal knockout that would leave viewers speechless and a host scrambling to save face. This is the story of how Greg Gutfeld learned the hard way that some guests refuse to be pushed around, no matter how big his ego gets behind that desk. The stage was set on what seemed like any other evening. The studio lights blazed down on the familiar talk show set, cameras rolling as always. Samuel L. Jackson, the legendary actor known for his commanding presence, both on and off screen, had agreed to appear as a guest. What should have been a standard promotional interview was about to turn into television chaos. Greg Gutfeld sat behind his desk with that smug expression he wore like a badge of honor. He had built his career on pushing boundaries and making controversial comments, thinking his position gave him license to say whatever came to mind. Tonight, he was about to discover that not everyone would tolerate his brand of provocative hosting. The interview started innocently enough. Jackson walked onto the set with his usual cool confidence, greeting the audience with a wave before taking his seat across from Gutfeld. The crowd responded with enthusiasm, clearly excited to see the iconic actor. "Welcome to the show, Samuel," Gutfeld began, leaning back in his chair with an air of casual superiority. "Great to have you here tonight." "Thanks for having me," Jackson replied, settling into his chair with the composed demeanor that had made him a Hollywood legend. But something was already off. There was a condescending tone in Gutfeld's voice that suggested this interview might not go as smoothly as Jackson had expected. The host had that look in his eyes, the one that meant he was planning something he thought would be clever. "So Samuel, you've been in the business for decades now," Gutfeld continued, emphasizing the word decades in a way that felt deliberately pointed. "How does it feel to still be getting work at your age?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Jackson's expression remained calm, but there was a subtle shift in his posture. Anyone who knew the actor could see that Gutfeld had just crossed his first line. "I feel grateful to still be doing what I love," Jackson responded diplomatically, though his voice carried a slight edge. "Age is just a number when you're passionate about your craft." Gutfeld chuckled, a sound that came across as patronizing rather than genuine. Right. Though I have to say, some of your recent movie choices have been, well, interesting. Not exactly what we'd expect from someone of your stature." The studio audience shifted uncomfortably. This wasn't the usual banter between host and guest. There was something mean-spirited about the way Gutfeld was conducting himself, as if he was deliberately trying to provoke his guest rather than have a normal conversation. Jackson maintained his composure, but his jaw tightened slightly. "Every project I choose has its merits. I don't make decisions based on what others expect." "Of course not," Gutfeld said, with a wave of his hand that somehow managed to be both dismissive and insulting. "Though between you and me, and everyone watching, some of those action movies you've been doing lately feel a bit, how should I put this delicately, repetitive. Same angry guy, same tough talk, same everything, really." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Jackson leaned forward slightly, his famous intensity beginning to surface. "Repetitive? That's an interesting way to describe a career that spans multiple genres and decades." Gutfeld was either oblivious to the warning signs or chose to ignore them completely. He pressed on with his line of questioning, his tone growing more inflammatory with each word. "Don't get me wrong, you've had some great roles, but lately it seems like you're just playing variations of the same character over and over. The tough guy with the leather jacket and the attitude. How many times can audiences watch the same performance?" Jackson's hands, which had been resting casually on the armrests of his chair, now gripped them more firmly. His voice remained level, but there was steel beneath the surface. "Every character I play brings something different to the screen. If you actually watch the films, instead of making assumptions, you might notice the nuances." The host laughed again, that same condescending sound that was becoming more grating by the minute. "Nuances? Come on, Samuel. You show up, you look intense, you deliver your lines with that famous voice of yours, and you collect your paycheck. It's a formula. And frankly, it's getting old." The studio audience was now completely silent, sensing that something significant was building. The usual energy of a talk show interview had been replaced by a tension that was almost palpable. Jackson sat back in his chair, studying Gutfeld with the kind of focus that had made him such a compelling actor. When he spoke again, his voice was quiet but carried an unmistakable warning. "You seem to have this whole thing figured out without actually knowing what you're talking about. That's an interesting approach to journalism. Gutfeld missed the warning entirely, too caught up in his own perceived cleverness to recognize that he was playing with fire. Hey, I call it like I see it. That's what people tune in for. Honest commentary, not sugar-coated publicity nonsense. Honest? Jackson repeated, raising an eyebrow. Is that what we're calling this? The host was now in full flow, completely unaware that he was about to step over a line that would change everything. He leaned forward, wearing a grin that suggested he thought he was being particularly witty. Look, Samuel, I respect what you've accomplished. But let's be real here. At this stage of your career, aren't you just coasting, playing it safe with these big-budget action movies instead of taking real risks? Jackson's expression hardened. The diplomatic mask he had been wearing throughout the interview was beginning to slip, revealing the intensity that had made him one of Hollywood's most formidable presences. Coasting? He said, his voice dropping to that low, dangerous register that movie audiences knew meant trouble was coming. Gutfeld, still completely oblivious to the storm he was brewing, nodded enthusiastically. Exactly. Coasting. Going through the motions. Banking on your reputation instead of actually challenging yourself artistically. The moment stretched out like a held breath. Jackson stared at his host with an expression that would have made most people immediately apologize and change the subject. But Gutfeld wasn't most people. He was a man so convinced of his own importance that he couldn't recognize when he was about to face consequences for his words. You know what? Jackson said finally, his voice still controlled but carrying an unmistakable edge. I think you've got some interesting opinions about my career. Why don't you tell me more about what you think I should be doing differently? It was a trap, beautifully laid and expertly disguised as genuine curiosity. But Gutfeld, drunk on his own sense of superiority, walked right into it. Gutfeld's eyes lit up like he had just been handed the keys to his own kingdom. He leaned back in his chair with the confidence of a man who had no idea he was about to be destroyed on his own show. Well, since you asked, Gutfeld began, his voice dripping with fake enthusiasm, I think you should stop taking these easy paychecks and actually challenge yourself. When was the last time you did a real dramatic role? Something that required actual acting instead of just showing up and being Samuel L. Jackson? The insult hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Jackson's jaw clenched, but he maintained his composure with the discipline of a man who had spent decades in Hollywood dealing with people exactly like this. A real dramatic role, Jackson repeated slowly, as if he was making sure he heard correctly. Interesting choice of words. But Gutfeld was just getting started. Having convinced himself that he was winning this exchange, he decided to dig deeper. I mean, look at your recent filmography. Action movie, voice work for animated films, another action movie. Where's the range? Where's the artist we used to see? Jackson leaned forward slightly, his voice taking on that deadly calm tone that anyone familiar with his work would recognize as a warning sign. The artist you used to see? Tell me, Greg, when exactly did you become an expert on my artistic choices? The question was delivered with surgical precision, designed to expose the host's complete lack of qualifications to make such judgments. But Gutfeld was too far gone to recognize the trap being set for him. Hey, I've been watching movies longer than most people, Gutfeld replied with a shrug that somehow managed to be both casual and arrogant. And I know talent when I see it. I also know when that talent is being wasted on mindless entertainment. The phrase, mindless entertainment, hit Jackson like a slap across the face. Here was a talk show host, a man whose own career consisted of making crude jokes and inflammatory comments, dismissing decades of carefully chosen work as mindless. Mindless entertainment? Jackson said, his voice now carrying a dangerous edge that made several audience members shift uncomfortably in their seats. That's how you'd describe the work I've done? Gutfeld nodded enthusiastically, completely missing the warning signs that were now practically flashing like neon lights. Look, don't take it personally. It's just business, right? Studios want familiar faces and familiar roles. You give them what they want, you get paid. I get it, but let's not pretend it's high art. Jackson sat perfectly still for a moment, processing what he had just heard. Here was a man who had built his career on cheap laughs and controversy, telling him that his life's work wasn't art. The audacity was almost breathtaking. So, according to you, Jackson said, his voice now dropped to that low register that sent chills down spines. My work is just mindless entertainment, not art, just business. Gutfeld, still oblivious to the danger he was in, nodded again. Exactly, and there's nothing wrong with that. Entertainment has its place. But let's call it what it is. The studio had gone completely silent. Even the cameramen seemed to sense that something explosive was building. Jackson stared at his host with an intensity that could have melted steel. "Let me make sure I understand this correctly," Jackson continued, each word measured and deliberate. "You, a talk show host whose idea of entertainment is making jokes about current events, are sitting here telling me that my career choices lack artistic merit." For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed Gutfeld's face, but his ego was too big to let him back down now. "I'm just being honest about what I see. Isn't that better than fake praise?" Jackson smiled, but it wasn't a pleasant smile. It was the kind of smile that appeared right before someone got exactly what they deserved. "Oh, I appreciate honesty," Jackson said, his voice now carrying a hint of something that made the temperature in the room seem to drop another few degrees. "In fact, I'm about to be very honest with you." Gutfeld shifted in his chair, finally beginning to sense that maybe he had pushed too hard, but he was in too deep to stop now. "Great, that's what good television is all about. Real conversation." Jackson leaned back in his chair, studying his host like a predator sizing up prey. "Real conversation. Is that what you call this? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks more like a man who thinks his platform gives him the right to insult his guests." The accusation hung in the air like a challenge. Gutfeld's face reddened slightly, his ego finally forcing him to defend himself. "Insult? I haven't insulted anyone. I've just been giving my honest opinion about your career choices." "Your honest opinion?" Jackson repeated, his voice now carrying a tone that would have made most people immediately apologize and change the subject. "Based on what exactly? Your extensive experience as an actor? Your deep understanding of the film industry? Your years of studying dramatic performance?" Each question was delivered like a surgical strike, precisely designed to expose the complete lack of foundation for Gutfeld's attacks. The host squirmed slightly, but his pride wouldn't let him back down. "I don't need to be an actor to recognize when someone is phoning it in," Gutfeld shot back, his voice rising slightly as he felt himself being backed into a corner. "And let's be honest, you've been phoning it in for years." The words hit Jackson like a physical blow. Here was this talk show host, this man whose greatest achievement was making controversial comments on television, accusing him of phoning it in. The sheer arrogance was staggering. Jackson's hands gripped the armrests of his chair so tightly that his knuckles went white. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, but it carried the kind of controlled fury that made everyone in the studio hold their breath. "Phoning it in," he said, each word dripping with barely contained rage. "You think I've been phoning it in?" Gutfeld, now completely committed to his position despite the obvious danger, nodded defiantly. "Yeah, I do. And I think deep down, you know it too." The accusation was the final straw. Jackson had sat through the condescending questions, the dismissive comments about his age, the attacks on his artistic choices. But being told that he knew he was phoning it in, that he was somehow complicit in the very thing he was being accused of, was too much. Jackson stood up slowly, his full height and presence suddenly filling the space between himself and the host. When he spoke, his voice carried the kind of quiet intensity that had made him one of the most compelling actors of his generation. "You know what, Greg? I think we need to have a real conversation about respect." Gutfeld looked up at the towering figure of Jackson, and for the first time in the interview, seemed to realize that he might have gone too far. But it was too late. The wheels were already in motion for what would become one of the most dramatic moments in talk show history. Jackson remained standing, his eyes fixed on Gutfeld with laser-like focus. "You invited me on your show. I came here as your guest, expecting a professional interview. Instead, I've been sitting here listening to you tear apart my career, my choices, and my integrity." The studio was so quiet that you could hear a pin drop. Every camera was focused on Jackson as he delivered what was clearly building toward a devastating conclusion. "But here's what really gets me," Jackson continued, his voice now carrying the full weight of his decades in the industry. "You sit behind that desk, making jokes and throwing around opinions like they're facts. And you think that gives you the right to judge other people's life work." Gutfeld opened his mouth to respond, but Jackson held up a hand that stopped him cold. "I'm not finished." The two words hit Gutfeld like a freight train. He sat frozen in his chair, finally understanding that he was no longer in control of his own show. Jackson loomed over the desk, his presence filling the entire studio with an energy that was both commanding and terrifying. "You want to talk about phoning it in?" Jackson continued, his voice now rising with controlled fury. "Let's talk about what phoning it in really looks like. It looks like a host who thinks controversy equals intelligence. It looks like someone who mistakes rudeness for honesty and believes that tearing others down somehow builds them up." Gutfeld's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water, but no words came out. The man who had built his career on having a quick comeback for everything was completely speechless. Jackson took a step closer to the desk, his eyes never leaving Gutfeld's face. You sit here night after night, making cheap shots at people who actually create things, people who actually contribute to culture, people who actually put themselves on the line for their art, and you call that entertainment? The studio audience was completely transfixed. This wasn't just a celebrity losing his temper. This was a master craftsman defending his life's work against someone who had grossly overstepped his boundaries. I've spent 40 years in this industry, Jackson continued, his voice now carrying the full weight of his experience and authority. 40 years learning my craft, choosing my roles, working with the best directors and actors in the world. And you, someone whose biggest achievement is making jokes about the news, are gonna sit there and tell me I'm phoning it in? Gutfeld finally found his voice, but it came out as a weak stammer. Now, Samuel, I think maybe we're taking this a little too seriously here. Jackson's laugh was sharp and humorless. Too seriously? You spend 20 minutes attacking my career, my choices, my integrity, and now you want to act like it was all just fun and games? The host tried to regain some control, gesturing weakly toward the cameras. Look, this is just television. We're just having a conversation here. Just television? Jackson's voice rose to a level that made everyone in the studio flinch. This is just television to you? My career, my reputation, my life's work? That's all just television to you? Gutfeld was now visibly sweating under the studio lights. His earlier confidence completely evaporated. I didn't mean to upset you. Maybe I came on a little strong. Jackson stared down at him with a look of complete disgust. A little strong? You called my work mindless entertainment. You said I was coasting. You accused me of phoning it in, and now you want to act like you were just being a little strong? The host tried one more time to salvage the situation. Look, Samuel, maybe we can just move on and talk about your new project. Move on? Jackson's voice was now at full volume, filling every corner of the studio. You think after disrespecting me for the better part of half an hour, you can just say, let's move on, and everything will be fine? Gutfeld was now completely out of his depth, his usual smugness replaced by genuine fear. I'm sorry if I offended you. That wasn't my intention. Jackson leaned down, placing both hands on the desk and bringing his face closer to Gutfeld's. When he spoke, his voice was quiet again, but it carried more menace than all his shouting had. If you offended me, there's no if about it. You did offend me. You offended me as an actor, as an artist, and as a human being. And your intention doesn't matter. What matters is what you said and how you said it. The studio was so quiet that the only sound was the low hum of the cameras continuing to roll. Everyone present knew they were witnessing something unprecedented. Jackson straightened up, his full height and presence once again dominating the space. You know what the real tragedy is here, Greg? You had the opportunity to have a real conversation with someone who's actually lived in this industry, someone who could have shared real insights and experiences. Instead, you chose to use your platform to tear down a guest who came here in good faith. Gutfeld tried one last desperate attempt to regain control. Samuel, please, let's just sit down and finish the interview like professionals. Jackson's response was swift and final. Professionals? You want to talk about being professional? A professional doesn't ambush his guests. A professional doesn't spend an entire interview trying to humiliate the person who agreed to appear on his show. A professional shows respect for the people who take time out of their lives to help make his show interesting. The host was now completely deflated, slumped in his chair like a balloon that had lost all its air. I really didn't mean for this to go this way. But it did go this way, Jackson replied, his voice carrying a note of finality. It went this way because you chose to make it go this way. You could have asked me about my upcoming projects. You could have talked about my experiences working with different directors. You could have had a real conversation about the craft of acting. Instead, you chose to attack me personally and professionally. Jackson paused, looking around the studio at the cameras, the crew, and the audience. When he spoke again, his voice carried a sadness that was somehow more devastating than his anger had been. This is what passes for entertainment now? This is what people tune in to see? A host tearing down his guests for cheap laughs and manufactured controversy? He turned back to Gutfeld, who was now staring down at his desk, unable to meet Jackson's eyes. You know what, Greg? I've been in this business long enough to know when I'm not welcome, and I've been around long enough to know when someone is more interested in creating drama than having a real conversation. Jackson walked back to his chair, But instead of sitting down, he reached for the small microphone that had been clipped to his jacket throughout the interview. With deliberate precision, he unclipped it and placed it on the seat of the chair. "I came here tonight as your guest," he said, his voice now calm but carrying an unmistakable note of authority. "I came here to talk about my work, to connect with your audience, and to have the kind of conversation that people might actually find interesting and enlightening." He looked directly into the camera, speaking not just to Gutfeld, but to everyone watching. "Instead, I found myself being lectured by someone who seems to think that having a television show gives him the right to disrespect the people who appear on it." Gutfeld made one final, desperate attempt to salvage something from the wreckage. "Samuel, please, don't leave like this. We can start over." Jackson turned to look at him one last time, and when he spoke, his words carried the weight of absolute finality. "Start over? You can't start over from disrespect, Greg. You can't take back the things you said. You can't undo the way you chose to treat a guest on your own show." He took a step toward the edge of the set, then paused and turned back. "You know what the saddest part about this whole thing is? You actually could have learned something tonight. You could have had a real conversation with someone who's been doing this work since before you even thought about getting into television. Instead, you chose to waste everyone's time with your ego and your need to feel superior." Jackson walked toward the exit, his departure as commanding and dignified as everything else about his presence. But just before he reached the edge of the set, he turned back one final time. "Good luck with your show, Greg. I hope someday you figure out the difference between being controversial and being interesting. I hope you learn that respect isn't something you can just turn on and off when it's convenient. And I hope you remember this moment the next time you think about treating a guest the way you treated me tonight." With that, Samuel L. Jackson walked off the set, leaving behind a stunned studio audience, a humiliated host, and what would become one of the most talked about moments in talk show history. Gutfeld sat alone at his desk, the weight of his behavior finally sinking in, realizing that his need to be provocative had cost him not just a guest, but his dignity and the respect of everyone who had witnessed his spectacular failure as a host.